In We Remember, we will examine the lives of three McLay men from the first three generations of McLays in New Zealand. Great-great-great-grandfather Thomas John McLay, sometimes referred to as Mac. Great-great-grandfather and Thomas John's son John, or Johnny McLay. And John's son, great-grandfather Thomas Benjamin McLay, known as Grumpy. Thomas John, or Mac, was born in Lennoxtown, East Dunbartonshire, Scotland, in what is believed to be 1817. His family originated from the district northwest of Glasgow, around Killearn. The McLays of the 18th century seem to be scattered on the surrounding estates, ranging in size from 150 to 200 acres, as tenants, labourers, weavers, wood merchants and wheelwrights. When it comes to tracing the origins of the clan McLay, very little written evidence exists, with most information in past centuries coming from word of mouth, often through the clan bard or seneschal, whose duty was to recapitulate his chief's family tree and embellish the good points in his master's favour. Gaelic was the common language of early Scotland, and when Latin and later English came to be used, attempts were made to translate the Gaelic names. Popular etymology commonly explains McLay as coming from the Gaelic Macinlay, and translated as meaning son of the physician, or living son. The latter is sometimes used to explain why the Livingstons belonged to Clan McLay. It has been said that the McLays were called son of the physician because they were descended from the physician to Somerled, Lord of the Isles, a mid-12th century Norse Gaelic lord. Through research, it is believed that the Macinlays were Scots who originally came from Ireland about 500 AD. They became followers of the MacDougals and their hereditary standard bearers. When Robert the Bruce achieved Scottish independence in 1314, following the Battle of Bannockburn, he routed and dispossessed those who had supported the English, the MacDougals among them.
MacDougall, you bastard!
A younger brother of the Stuart clan took control, and thus founded the Stuarts of Appin clan. It appears they adopted the McLay family title. The Stuarts of Appin, and thus Clan McLay, supported the ill-fated Jacobite rebellion of 1745. Led by their charismatic leader Bonnie Prince Charles at the Battle of Culloden, the ill-armed, ill-fed and exhausted Jacobites were massacred by the superior and experienced English army.
Oi, Bonnie Prince Charles!
At Culloden today, a modest cairn marks the common grave of the Appin followers, the Stuarts, the McLays, the Livingstons, and other allied sects. Thomas John's grandfather, Moses John McLay, was born around 1756 and was a weaver. He married Helen in 1783. His son Moses was born in 1786 in Killearn. He was a block printer at Balfour. He resided at Kendrick Field, near Killearn. Calico printing became a major industry in the area in the late 1780s. Calico was a plain cotton cloth which originated from Calicut on the east coast of India. Moses married Margaret Adams from Lennoxtown in 1810, moving there with his employers. There has been some conjecture as to the year of Thomas John's birth, ranging from 1812 to 1819. 1817 is the most likely, as evidence has been found that Thomas John was 45 years old when he died. Then in 1824 came a strike by the block printers for better pay and conditions.
We demand our rights! We demand them!
Thomas John's father Moses, though a deeply religious and mild-mannered man, became involved. He was a man universally respected and was appointed treasurer of the strike funds. He never resumed work in Lennoxtown after the strike, but continued a life of Christian activity and great usefulness, often tending to the sick and dying, to comfort and engage in prayer for the afflicted. Moses died in 1837, aged 56, having caught typhoid from an individual whom he'd been called in to pray for. Little information regarding Thomas John's early life exists. However, one thing is certain, that he married Margaret Russell about 1840. Though no record of their marriage has been discovered, their eldest child John, who will be covered in more detail in the next episode, is entered in the Kirkintilloch Parish Register on the 4th of March 1841 as the lawful son of his parents, meaning he was born within wedlock.
You're in the register now.
The Russells were a much respected farming family of Meikle Hill Farm, Kirkintilloch, keeping cows and growing strawberries for the Glasgow market.
What nice strawberries you have.
Thomas John was employed as a ploughman on the farm, and where one could assume he met Margaret. Born in 1819, she was described as being tallish, dignified, and strong-looking physically and in character. Margaret's father, John Russell, was the tenant of Meikle Hill Farm. Thomas John and Margaret had a second son, James, born in 1843. It was also around this time that Thomas John commenced work on the new local railway network as a railway ganger, moving to Oxgang. It is unknown as to the specifics, either working on the Monkland and Kirkintilloch Railway, which connected with the Forth and Clyde Canal at Kirkintilloch, or the new Edinburgh and Glasgow line, which opened in 1842. It was here in Oxgang that Thomas John and Margaret's third child, Janet, also known as Jessie, was born in June 1845, and in late September 1846, Mary was born. Then came the time Thomas John and Margaret decided to emigrate with their 4 children to New Zealand. Thomas John had been engaged by a Mr. Alexander Todd to work for him in New Zealand, Thomas as a ploughman and Margaret as dairymaid. It appears that the family were assisted passengers, where their fares were part paid for by benefactors or employers. Also colonial organisations such as the Otago Association. The Otago Association was founded in 1845 by adherents of the Free Church of Scotland, with the purpose of establishing a colony of like-minded Scots in Otago, chiefly at Dunedin. In addition to religion, the economy was also a motivator in the association's foundation and operations. The highland clearances, crop failures and population pressures in industrialised urban centres all created conditions that by the mid-19th century made immigration seem highly attractive to many poorer Scots.
The price of fish has dropped. Aye, me crops have failed again.
On September 11th, 1849, having said farewell to close family, Thomas John and family travelled by train to Greenock on the Clyde and embarked aboard the Multan, bound for New Zealand. The Multan was indeed a fine ship for its day, a new, fully rigged vessel of 580 tons. She was making her maiden voyage. The voyage out to New Zealand was not without incident. In fact, it was a miracle that the Multan ever reached its destination. Departing Greenock on September 12th, the route was south down the Irish Channel and then out into the Atlantic Ocean, passing close to the Madeira Islands, then Tenerife, over the equator, past Tristan da Cunha, before heading east into the Southern Ocean and the Roaring Forties. New Zealand was first sighted from Fogo Strait, and then the Multan sailed up the southeast coast, arriving off the Otago heads on Christmas Day, 1849.
Dear God, cholera!
First peril encountered on the voyage was cholera. It was prevalent in Greenock at the time, and it broke out in the vessel on September the 21st and continued to October the 15th. 20 cases were detected, of whom 9 died, including a passenger in the next berth to John and his brother James. In calm waters, the Multan was almost wrecked on the rough coast of Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic. The ship was only saved when the crew and a number of the male passengers manned rowboats with fixed ropes attached to the Multan in an attempt to drag her away. This worked to some degree, but they were ultimately saved by the wind increasing in time. On another occasion, barely 2 hours from crossing the heads into Otago harbour, the Multan narrowly missed wrecking on rocks, actually hitting, but not sustaining any significant damage.
Rocks! Rocks!
The vessel safely arrived and anchored off Tairoa Head. The Multan's figurehead, an American Indian in aggressive pose with a wrap around his waist, a lance in one hand and a club in the other, greatly intrigued the local Maori, who came out from their kite at Tairoa Head to investigate. The Multan flew the yellow quarantine flag because she had carried cholera. The following day she anchored at Port Chalmers, and fresh meat was enjoyed by the passengers. The McLays were the last to leave the ship, as Thomas John was in charge of Flecky, a dairy cow owned by Alexander Todd. Flecky had made the voyage and had supplied fresh milk, not only to both families but to others on board. Thomas John had to take her along the coast to Sawyers Bay, then over the saddle into Northeast Valley and Dunedin. The rest of the family went by open boat up the harbour into Dunedin. Eventually, all were reunited at their first New Zealand residence, the first house on the left up Rattray Street. They remained here until January the 15th, when they were rowed across the harbour to Anderson's Bay, to first live in a house built by Anderson, then in a mai-mai, while a house was being built by Alexander Todd, whose employ Thomas John now found himself. The mai-mai was little more than a shelter, without walls, windows or doors. The family slept on the floor and were nearly eaten alive by rats and mosquitoes. When they left for the new house, humble with mud walls and floors, the mai-mai was burned down to dislodge the rats. Later in 1850, Margaret was born. She was the first European baby born in Anderson's Bay. By the following year, Mary, now aged 5, was termed to be in ill health. After 3 years of settlement, Dunedin had a population of 1,068, 297 being children. A young John and James McLay infrequently attended school near the present-day law courts in Dunedin, making the long and difficult journey to school from their home at the back of Anderson's Bay Hill. Their home overlooked the Tomahawk Lagoon, with Lawyer's Head about a mile to the right. The approximate location of the home can be seen in these present-day photographs, looking back from Tomahawk Lagoon. In 1852, Thomas John changed employer. Having completed the work he had been engaged in by Alexander Todd, he was hired by Arthur Burns of Grants Braes for harvesting and general labouring. This required the family to move 2 miles further down the harbour, their 5th move since arriving in New Zealand. The new home was smaller than the previous house, 2 rooms made of timber and clay, and a loft where the children slept. A few months later, Thomas McLay was born in Grants Braes, Thomas John's and Margaret's 6th child. Later in 1852, upon completion of the harvest for Burns, the family moved back to Dunedin, to Squatter's Gully, up above what is now McLagan Street. There were 4 houses built of clay, each had an acre of cleared land where potatoes and other vegetables were grown. Thomas John bought the right to the land and house, and established a home there. Later that year, Thomas John began work for a former Multan gentleman, Francis Scott Pillins, at Port Molyneux, South Otago. For an unknown reason, the work did not last long, and he began work for a man at Lake Waikouaiti. Once again, this was short-lived due to the appalling working and living conditions. It was also noted that the man was going mad. It is now in the McLay family story where we introduce a major character who would feature prominently in the early years of the family's life in Otago, John, or Johnny, Jones. Johnny Jones was born in Sydney in 1809. The son of a convict, Jones was a streetwise child growing up in the Rocks area of Sydney. He had a reactive temper and was known to solve his problems and disputes with his fists. In his youth, he worked aboard whaling and sealing ships, and then as a waterman and ferryman at Port Jackson.
Aye, that be Port Jackson.
He married Sarah Sizemore in January 1828, when he was 19 years old. Jones had an entrepreneurial streak and invested his savings in whaling ships. By 1835, he went into partnership to purchase a whaling station in New Zealand and a schooner for whaling. Within the next few years, he had gained a controlling interest in 7 New Zealand whaling stations. In 1838, Jones bought a whaling station at Karatane and land near present-day Waikouaiti in East Otago. Later that year, he purchased land from Kaitahu chief Hone Bloody Jack Tuaiki, amounting to a considerable part of what is now North and Central Otago. However, much of this purchase was annulled when the South Island lands were ceded to the Crown. Jones was eventually allowed to keep around 11,000 hectares. Tuawaiki was born in 1805 at Inchclutha in South Otago, and became a paramount Kaitahu chief in the southern part of the South Island, residing predominantly on Ruapuki Island. He gained the nickname Bloody Jack from his earlier interactions with whalers on account of his redcoats worn by him and his whaling crew. Tuawaiki gained prominence in the 1830s when several war parties, or toa, led by him defeated a number of North Island toa in the upper part of the South Island, and at Tutarau in Southland in 1836, where he defeated a marauding war party of Ngāti Tama and Ngāti Toa warriors, the last act of intertribal warfare in the South Island. In June 1840, Tuawaiki signed the Treaty of Waitangi aboard the HMS Herald at Ruapuki Island. 4 years later, in 1844, he drowned in waters south of Timaru. In 1840, Johnny Jones established his organised settlement at Waikouaiti, called Matanika Farm. The brig Magnet arrived off Waikouaiti beach, bringing with it 12 families from Sydney, who grew crops and tended to horses, cattle and sheep, imported from New South Wales. In 1843, due to a financial depression in Sydney, Jones moved his family permanently to New Zealand. He initially divided his time between Wellington and Waikouaiti before settling in the latter in 1848. The Waikouaiti area is the cradle of the McLay family in New Zealand, lying 32 kilometres north of the Otago harbour. It has a long, curved sweep of beach, dominated at one end by the imposing split mountain of Matanika. At the southeast end juts out a craggy peninsula, once the site of a pre-European Maori kike. Close by is the site of the Huriawa Pa, a fortified village strategically set on the rock promontory above the coast. At its base, the Waikouaiti River flows into the Pacific Ocean. In 1853, Thomas John was engaged by Johnny Jones to go to his newer farm at Waikouaiti, Cherry Farm. Employed as a ploughman and farm labourer, his eldest son John, aged 12, was also engaged to drive the team at plough and draw fencing and firewood for the farm. Jones had established a farm here in 1850, located on the plains south of Hawkesbury. The town of Waikouaiti was initially called Hawkesbury. It officially became Waikouaiti in 1909. The journey north to Waikouaiti by the McLay family was made in the Fanny, a small coastal vessel of about 6 tons, run by well-known character Antonio Joseph, an ex-Portuguese whaler. Joseph had deserted from his ship in Otago in 1847. He then began trading up and down the South Island coast. On arriving in the Karitani estuary, the McLay family and their goods were carried ashore by crew and helpful local Maori, including Mrs. Mary Harper, known as Big Mary, and the heavily tattooed Ria Tikini, or Mrs. Chicken. She was responsible for carrying John ashore, but dropped him in the tide because he took a fancy to tickling her. Mrs. Chicken died in 1919, aged 110. Johnny Jones was a generous local benefactor, donating land, goods and services to religious denominations and lay people alike. He was, however, a man that possessed a hasty and ungoverned temper, often ready to clinch an argument with a physical fight.
I'll knock your block off, by God I will.
But his displays of temper were often followed by fits of remorse and acts of recompense to the victims of his displeasure.
My apologies, indeed.
The family was not long at Cherry Farm when Thomas John and Jones had a quarrel over part payment of services by rations from Jones, and that the act of grinding of wheat into flour had to be done after a hard day's work. Often there was not enough flour for the evening meal till this was done.
There's no damn flour again.
There was a heated exchange, and as a result Thomas John gave notice and ordered the family to pack up for Dunedin.
Jones, we're off.
Next day Jones begged him not to leave, and offered an increase in wages, an extra flour and oatmeal.
Please, Mac, I beg you, don't leave.
Another such story is one that has passed into family folklore. Thomas John became involved in a quarrel with Jones regarding the price of a cow. Jones wanted a certain price and Thomas John was only prepared to pay a lower price. Jones then proposed that they wrestle, with the winner paying their price. Thomas John agreed.
I agree.
The two adjourned to the barn, and other workers stopped work to watch. The first man to get 2 falls would be the winner.
Aye, there's going to be a fight here. A fight, Johnny Jones and Mark McLay.
Jones is wrestling McLay.
Both men were strong. Jones of medium height, Thomas John well over 6 foot. Jones had the science, and Thomas John the advantage of height and strength. Thomas John won the first, and after what was noted at the time as a hard tussle, the second, and the agreed price for the cow. In another completely different and embellished version of the tale, Thomas Benjamin McLay, Thomas John's grandson, was quoted in an Otago Daily Times article from 1962.
Tom's grandfather had come to New Zealand in 1849, bringing the first cow into the country. Tom told the tale with great relish.
The cow had been brought out to feed the McLay family on board ship, but that bugger Johnny Jones coveted it.
They decided on a wrestling match.
My grandfather, who was 6 foot 6 inches tall, put up the cow as he lost. And I can't remember what Johnny Jones put up as a stake. But anyway, he lost and my grandfather kept his cow.
In 1854, with the harvest over, the hay brought in and the ploughing completed, for some undisclosed reason, Thomas John, Margaret and their 6 children returned to Dunedin. They once again completed the journey in the Fanny with Anton Joseph. The Fanny was almost swamped in the Waikouaiti sandbar. Once in Dunedin, it was noted they were living in a property on High Street. Johnny Jones, meanwhile, moved permanently to Dunedin. He moved into his property known as Fern Hill in Dunedin. It was rebuilt for his wife Sarah and was completed in 1867. Later in 1854, Thomas John and family returned to the Waikouaiti area, once again employed by Johnny Jones, living and working at Cherry Farm. That same year Elizabeth was born, Thomas John's and Margaret's 7th child. 1856 saw the arrival of twins David and Anne, then 2 years later the birth of Agnes in 1858. Thomas John and Margaret's 10 children ranged from John, aged 17, to Agnes, a newborn baby. 1858 saw the construction and opening of the Anglican Church of St. John of the Evangelist in Beach Street, Waikouaiti. It is the oldest surviving church building in Otago in Southland and was built on land donated by Johnny Jones. Margaret was undoubtedly a remarkable woman, but one of many remarkable women of the pioneering era in New Zealand. Often described as of a cheery disposition in the face of adversity, Margaret in particular maintained a household and raised a large number of children with limited means and in an often very difficult and demanding condition.
She often had such a cheery disposition, given the circumstances.
Around this time, Thomas John and Margaret moved their family to the second house, since demolished, in Henry Street, Waikouaiti, with Thomas John continuing to work for wages for Johnny Jones. However, he did reportedly have a small farm on Island Farm, on the right side of the main road entering Waikouaiti from the south. Thomas John was drowned in the Hawkesbury Lagoon on the 28th of August 1862. He was returning from a meeting with Johnny Jones and his lawyers at Matanika, where Jones had built a fine house. The circumstances surrounding Thomas John's drowning are unknown and can only be speculated on. A pitch-black night, a wet ground and a short cut taken. One slip could be fatal. Had Thomas John been drinking, and if so, had this impaired his physical ability? There is also the distinct possibility that he could not swim, as was the case with the majority of adults from this era. The one thing we do know is that Thomas John's body was discovered near where the lagoon meets the present-day Waikouaiti racecourse. Margaret was left with 8 children to care for. John married in 1861, and Mary, who had always had an undisclosed illness, died the same year, aged 14. Perhaps James, now aged 19, was the breadwinner for a while, or perhaps Johnny Jones treated her with generosity. Thomas John McLay is a hazy figure. On the little evidence we have, we are certain he was hard-working, independent, and quick-tempered. Physically extremely strong and tall, supposedly 6'6". He stood by his principles and seemed content to work for wages. Margaret continued to live in Waikouaiti until her passing in 1893, aged 74. She is buried in St. John's Cemetery and shares the headstone with her husband Thomas John and their daughters Mary and Margaret. Thomas John and Margaret must be admired and congratulated for their incredible pioneering spirit. Venturing far from their family and friends, with 4 young children, knowing they would never return from a distant, inhospitable and untamed land, where great trial and hardship awaited, but where they ultimately forged a future for their children that continues to this day.